Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Andrew Feenberg. Professor Andrew Feenberg is an American philosopher of technology and continental philosophy at Simon Fraser University, and he specializes in the thought of Lukács, Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, and technology more broadly. He's the author of numerous books, such as The Philosophy of Praxis, and most recently, and most relevant to the subject of this podcast, is The Ruthless Critique of Everything Existing, Nature and Revolution in Marcuse's Philosophy of Praxis. And we're going to dive deep into some of the more difficult aspects of Herbert Marcuse's thought. And this will complement, I hope, my most recent video on Herbert Marcuse and One Dimensional Man. So, first, I think it would be great, Andrew, if you could tell us a bit about your intellectual background and your special, unique relationship to Herbert Marcuse and the ways he's influenced you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Tony. I guess it's I have a complicated intellectual background. I grew up in the middle of the scientific community and spent a lot of my youth and college years studying science, but I was always interested in philosophy. And eventually that became my main concern, my main subject. I wanted to study continental philosophy. And in the 1960s, when I was a student in college, that was not easy. American philosophy was almost entirely analytic. And I had a friend who said, I was looking for a graduate school, and I had a friend who said, you should look at the University of California, San Diego. I said, why? He said, well, they have Marcuse. And I said, who's he? And he said, well, he's a guy who's writing about Marx and Freud. And I said, wow, any guy crazy enough to do that is crazy enough for me. And I immediately sent off my application and they took me. And so I arrived in San Diego, ready to study with this crazy guy. And the first thing I did was ask him to do a reading course with me on Heidegger's Being and Time. So that's how our relationship started out. And we had big arguments about being in time. I thought I knew more about it than he did. Of course, he was sure he knew more than I did, and I guess he was right. But it was fun. And then the other graduate students who'd come there to study with Marcuse decided we should create a magazine. This was the time of the anti-war protests. So we developed our own magazine. There were very few ways for people to learn about what was wrong with the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, in the early 60s. So we actually had quite an audience for our magazine. And Marcuse gave us articles and we found other things. For example, an article from a French article that we translated. And so that was my early years with Marcuse. And later on, I came back to San Diego after teaching elsewhere, and we became friends and spent a lot of time together. It's only though recently that I've actually gone back to his work and tried to really understand the deeper aspects of it. So it's strange. It had a big impact on me. It's certainly what influenced me to study technology, but it was not actually the main concern for most of my academic career. I was more interested in technology studies and in Lukács than in Marcuse. Then recently, some years ago, I decided to restudy Marcuse, and I wrote a book that was a kind of, what would you say, a preliminary study. And then this new book, which is goes much deeper, came out in last year. And it is what I can do with Marcuse.
I actually read your book right after around the time I finished my master's dissertation. And because one, I like to see good secondary sources because there's some people like Douglas Kellner, of course, who are very
Mhm.
helpful, and a professor I studied under, Terry Malley. But when it comes to Marcuse scholarship, there's, I think, a lack of deep dives into his philosophical foundations, which I thought was so helpful about your book because you go into Marcuse's Marxist influence, his Heideggerian influence, his Hegelian influence, and I think one concept of Marcuse that I think is a good bridge to his philosophical influences is that of technological rationality and his broader theory of technology. Can you tell us a bit about what that was?
Well, Marcuse used term technological rationality to talk about a a cultural form that had overtaken advanced capitalist societies. This is a cultural form in the sense that it concerns people's everyday understanding of the world. And what is that everyday understanding of the world in advanced societies? According to Marcuse, it is colonized by science. People have taken up in their everyday understanding concepts, an attitude that really is more appropriate to science rather than to everyday life. Now, let me see if I can make clear why that's important. It's not that Marcuse is saying that science is false or wrong. He's not against science. It's just that science is a particular way of viewing the world, and it has its powers by which we can understand great, many things of importance, but it also has its limitations. Those limitations matter if you take them out of the realm of science into the everyday world. So, for example, before modern times, most people, at least in Europe, thought of science in terms of Aristotle. Aristotle was, in fact, the first guy to create something we call science. In his science, objects have potentialities. Potentialities are the let's say the normative feature of the object, that aspect of the object which it tends toward, which it wants to develop into. Now, you can see why Aristotle would think this and why people who read Aristotle thought it made sense. You look at an acorn and it turns into an oak. You look at a 5-year-old kid and it turns into who knows, a professor of philosophy. Anything is possible, right? Things always are in motion, and their movements are directed toward a goal of some sort. That's the notion of potentiality, which Aristotle thought was part of the real world. It was an essential part of understanding the world. What happens with modern science from Galileo on is the elimination of potentiality. You can't use that concept any longer. Instead, everything becomes mechanistic. You have to look at the causal relations, and those causal relations may or may not tend toward some goal. That's simply a matter of chance. It's not an essential feature of the thing itself. So the acorn turns into the oak. We now know how that happens. And it's through various causal interactions within the acorn and its relation to the earth and so on. And all that is very different from the notion that the acorn contains within itself a potential that it is seeking for and striving for. Okay, so why is this important? Well, because in our everyday life, we still think like Aristotle. We still think a lot about potentialities, especially, for example, in relation to children. We're always seeing them as growing toward some future. Now, what Marcuse is worried about is the fact that this scientific view, which is fine for science and good for technology and makes a lot of sense, is infiltrating our everyday understanding of the world so that we think less and less in terms of potentialities. And this has consequences. If we don't think about potentialities, we have no norms by which to understand the developments around us. There's no easy way then to decide what is right. What we end up simply following the rules of whoever has the power to organize what's going to come next. So the world becomes then completely overtaken by the subjective demands of people with power, and we don't have any guide that could help us to avoid simply giving in to to the system, whatever that system may be. Whereas, in the earlier times, people had some guide in the form of a sense of what are the correct potentialities that should be the, for the future development of X, Y, and Z. Now it's just whatever corporations want. And that's going to be what the way the world is supposed to be. So the world becomes, I think Adorno says somewhere, the world has become its own, I can't remember exactly his term. The world as it is given to us becomes its own norm. It no longer is on the way to something normatively better, but is its own norm. And this is what Marcuse takes to mean by the concept of technological rationality as it applies to the whole culture of advanced societies.
And that brings us right to his concept of one-dimensional thought,
Yes.
because often when people hear that one-dimensionality, they think, "Oh, one's just thinking in one perspective," if that's how one would think in the everyday sense of one-dimensionality. And if one looks at the introduction, the preface, Douglas Kellner's preface in, One-Dimensional Man, he he defines one-dimensionality in the correct way, but also if one only goes off that definition, I think we forget what a one-dimensional thought is about, which we'll get right into, because he talks about one-dimensionality being conformity to pre-established norms and ways of thinking and doing things, but there's a deeper layer to one-dimensionality that's ties right into his political accusation, if you will, of advanced industrial society being totalitarian, because he seems to be saying it's totalitarian at the very level of thought in terms
Mhm.
of what we're able to really conceive. In many ways, I was saying that he prefigures, it seems, Mark Fisher and many people now who write about capitalist realism, the phenomenon of that we can't imagine alternatives. Well, that's the seeds of that are contained in one-dimensional thought. What is one-dimensional thought? And I guess you alluded to it with the exclusion of potentialities already, but maybe further elaboration would help because that is, of course, a
Yeah.
difficult one to wrap one's head around.
Yeah. It's simply another way of thinking about this idea of technological rationality. In order to make sense of one dimensional thought, you need to understand what the second dimension is, the missing dimension. And
Mhm.
that's missing dimension is potentiality. It is the possibilities that are excluded by the organization of the capitalist system. So the system excludes possibilities that could bring about a better form of existence for people, but those possibilities are systematically eliminated from consideration, from thought. So people live in a one-dimensional world means they live in a world which excludes uh, the possibility of a better world. So now, this has deep roots. In earlier times, the second dimension was present in the form of religion. There was always the thought that this world was only one world. There was another world that was better. And then in the 19th century, the bourgeoisie developed a whole religion of art, a secular form of religion. Art became the source of a second dimension that prefigured some kind of a better world that, of course, was only in the museum, but still you could understand what it was. You could think about it. You could hope for it. You could infuse your sense of what is important and what life is about. And this second dimension begins to disappear in the 20th century as people become caught up in the one dimensional society.
And why does that disappear? For the people in the crowd who might say, that sounds like idealism, which you'd be
Well,
surprised a lot of Marxists these days kind of forget what idealism is a category, but they tend to dismiss anything at any historiography of ideas as idealists, even though clearly Marcuse is grounding this in a material reality. But yeah, maybe go into that
I
if
think it
you
would be
weren't already.
difficult. Well, the point, what happens, according to Marcuse, and I think this is shared by other members of the Frankfurt School, is the development of consumer society. The capitalist system becomes sufficiently prosperous, sufficiently efficient to be able to offer people material goods, and those goods take the place of the second dimension, which no longer really, I mean, it's a kind of materialization of idealism. It's not that idealism disappears, it just takes the form of washing machines, automobiles, planes, airplane trips. This is now the heaven that people, or the art that people are living through. And so the, the power of of consumption as a form of life, as a way of understanding what is good and bad, what is important and what is unimportant, this then becomes the alternative to the second dimension. And so the system then is closed. It's closed because people don't aspire to something beyond it. What they aspire is only to things within it, a better car. As for, I'm not sure what to say about the charge of idealism. It's a bit strange. I don't know really what
You
to
don't
make
need
of
to. You don't need to because it's kind of it's you don't
it.
need to stoop to that level of silliness. But with regard to potentiality, it might seem evident that there are no alternatives politically on the horizon. And one critique that wasn't as unreasonable that I've heard is that Marcuse is over analyzing this at the dimension of subjectivity and applying what is a contemporary moment. And as a result, people think that his work is no longer relevant because it was only relevant to the post-war era in which you have the compromise of Keynesianism and et cetera. And people say, well, now politics is on the horizon again. And I kind of doubt that just because most of the politics that seem on the horizon seem all within, but as you said, thinking within that same system. They are creating their politics based on the existing state of affairs. But how deep does this really go for Marcuse in terms of you mentioned that it starts with a conflict of philosophy and it starts with industrial capitalism, but of course he applies this to the Soviet Union too, with his Soviet Marxism, right? And he critiques also Soviet Union in one-dimensional thought. And yeah, I wonder if you could speak to that because some people would say that is a response. Well, what about this alternative?
Well, there's several things going on here. Let me just start with the first thing you mentioned. Is Marcuse outdated because Keynesianism is no longer operating in our neoliberal economy? I think that's incorrect. Marcuse wrote a book late in his life called Counter Revolution and Revolt, in which, although he doesn't, at the time, people weren't using the term neoliberal, it's about neoliberalism. It's about the attempt of the capitalist class to reorganize the economy and the society in response to the new left, in response to the social movements of the 1960s and 70s that challenged the system. And so he has already in the late 70s, he's already got an analysis of the sort of thing that is now current. This, what he called the counter revolution, which we call neoliberalism. If Marcuse was so wrong, why is Donald Trump winning the election? Come on. Nothing so fundamental has changed that we can now say that the 1960s and 70s are like the Middle Ages. And the people who wrote about it or like Thomas Aquinas. This is silly. There's very little change. It is true, of course, that the contract between the big corporations and the unions is over. Now there's not the same kind of common purpose that there was in the 60s when the corporate and union movements were working together. That's true. Then you can find other differences, but it doesn't make a really big change in the mentality. This people are still living according to what Marcuse called the one dimensional thought. When they escape from it, they often move into the realm of conspiracy theories and fascist propaganda, which is not really a good look if you are thinking about revolution. I don't think that we're really out of the realm of one dimensionality. It is the best we can do at the moment, perhaps the wrong way to put it, but it's what we are stuck with at the moment for the most part, because there are no really powerful social movements attempting to overthrow capitalism. That's the fact. Uh, there are complicated issues that we could discuss about other social movements that are not socialist in character, but are not one dimensional. But the main point of Marcuse's argument in One Dimensional Man had to do with the complete collapse of the socialist alternative. And that's still the case, as far as I can see, in the capitalist world. So the problem that people have today seems to me to be that they don't understand what happened in the New Left. They think that somehow the way politics is pursued today is normal. It is not normal. The left politics from the mid 19th century until the Second World War in the US and in Europe until quite recently was organized through the socialist movement, through communist parties eventually. And the background, the backbone of the movement was the labor unions. That's simply gone. And it disappeared in the US in the 1960s at a time when McCarthyism in the 1950s destroyed what little remained of the socialist movement in the US. And then in the 60s, new movements emerged. And those movements developed around themes like imperialism, anti imperialism, feminism, ecology, professional changes in professions like medicine and so on. Movements occurred in many different spheres in the 1960s and 70s. And those movements created a new kind of left. Now, there are people today who would like to return to the old mode of communist parties with the labor movement as the base. I'm not against it, but I just don't see it having much effect. Instead, the larger movements are still fairly small, but they're much bigger than any movement based on the Communist Party. And so Marcuse he understood something important had happened, a fundamental change in the nature of the left. And that change is still ongoing. It's still our left. When people complain about the new left and they say it was a bunch of kids and it was all about sex or whatever, I mean, I don't know all the silly things people say, but they completely lost their own history because it's their history. These leftists who think that the new left was a mistake of some sort, it's their history. They still are operating under the conditions that emerged in the 1960s and 70s. And so I don't think Marcuse is out of date at all. I think, on the contrary, you can't understand what's happening now without at least paying some attention to what he wrote.
Probably really good contemporary example that justifies your point is you might not be aware of this sort of resurgence of communism online, which in many ways is quite exciting. It's interesting that so many people are getting into communism, but a lot of people don't know where to go from there. And I guess a testament to One dimensional thought is the fact that a lot of people are simply copying and pasting old, actually existing communism. So a lot of people with Stalin avatars, Mao avatars, Lenin avatars. I don't really have a problem with that, but who are kind of basic, almost in a, I guess maybe postmodernists would say, hauntological way, are kind of, you have this ghosts of the past appearing, and that what better example? What does that show other than the inability to imagine something outside of the state of affairs? But there's these discussions happening with people who want to deal with the history, which I think is in its there's a long way to go, but that's this idea of not being able to imagine something past capitalism. I mean, we went into it about the ontological dimension of this understanding, the real versus the potential. I would like to return to that because when it comes to the real versus the potential, the actual versus the possible, this distinction is something that I think can be seen as sounds a lot more simple than it is. And maybe it's worth getting into the theorist who Marcuse draws inspiration from with regard to this, which is most of all Hegel. And you have
Mm.
this great chapter, a very helpful chapter on Hegel, on Marcuse's understanding of Hegel. If you would like to elaborate on the way Hegel has influenced Marcuse's thought on one dimensionality, because of course that's related to two dimensionality, and the inverse of one dimensional thought in many ways is dialectical thinking.
Well, I'm not sure that I have much more to say that I can say right now about, because in fact, the way I described one technological rationality and one dimensionality is in fact straight out of Marcuse's Hegel.
Mhm.
It's the way in which he understands Hegel. So there are, of course, interesting problems with the notion of potentiality that go beyond what Hegel could have imagined. For example, it's clear that the teleological notion of potential has a very different status in the social world than in the world of the natural phenomena. The acorn turns into the oak because of a mechanism of some sort that we can understand. The way in which capitalism could turn into socialism is quite different. Well, it's not going to be some sort of mechanism. It's going to be through our imagination and our power to envisage and to collectively create a different world, a different way of understanding life. And so this raises questions that don't appear in Hegel, questions about democracy, about social movements, and so on that come out of essentially out of Marxism, uh, of a kind of uh, a, uh, a non-Stalin Marxism that is based on a mass movement rather than a bureaucratic control. And that is part of Marcuse's legacy also, his attempt to develop an idea of socialism as potential, as potential that is occluded, blocked by the organization of a one-dimensional system.
Part of what I also wanted you to elaborate on is dialectical thinking, because that is sort
Mm.
of like Adorno. In many ways, Adorno and Marcuse have a very similar project going on with dialectic of the Enlightenment and one-dimensional man. We'll get into their differences when we get into Marcuse's new concept of reason, if you will, or his new sensibility. But that's, very complicated. I wanna wait till I wanna take some baby steps before we get there, because I find that I'm still confused with the new sensibility part, probably because I haven't read enough Kant. But with, regard to dialectics, in what way is that an alternative, that can help people get away from one-dimensional thought?
Well, I think Adorno and Marcuse have rather similar ideas about dialectics, but they use different language to talk about it. And of course, since Adorno is so much more obscure and difficult, he's much more fun for academics. And so he gets all the attention. But in fact, I think they're really working toward the same idea. And it is a Hegelian idea. It's the notion that what we take for things, substances in the philosophical sense of the term, are in fact not self-contained, but always belong to a field of some sort. They always belong to a larger realm within which they are a kind of operation. You could think of them things as like the whirlpool that goes down the drain in your bathtub. It's there, it's a real thing, but it's temporary and it only exists through its connection to all the other things around it. So things are not things in the everyday sense of the term. That's our everyday view because we're operating in a common sense mode where we kind of cut off all the relations between things. This is much easier to understand when you think about it in terms of technical items. Like, is an automobile a thing? Well, in a sense, it's a thing. You can get into it, you can drive it, and so on. But it only exists because there are roads. In the 19th century, there were no roads for things like cars. They had to build the roads in order for cars to actually function properly. Furthermore, there are no gas stations in those days. You had to have gas in order for your car to work. So, in fact, your car is not a thing. It's part of a network, and that network includes roads and oil companies and gas stations. And you understand, this is the nature of the thing is actually much more complex than it looks. And understanding that is fundamental to making sense of the social world. So you think about a university. What is a university? We all are in universities. So we think we know what it is, but actually there's so many connections that are not visible in the nice buildings that exemplify universities. And those connections are what makes the university a university. It exists only through its connections. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It exists, but it exists only through its connections. So Adorno talks about this in terms of the concept of identity and non-identity and the notion of constellations. The constellations are the concepts through which you're able to understand the thing in its connections. Marcuse talks about it in terms of the notion of potentiality, which is also an Adornian concept, although it's less salient in his use of the term non-identity. Marcuse is primarily, he also thinks of the thing as part of a network of connections that make it possible for it to function as a thing. But it also contains its potentials. It is always on the move. It's not just a being, it's a becoming. And this, he calls the understanding of the thing in its potential as a substantive understanding. It takes you beyond the immediate empirical form of the thing, which is what science needs for its work and what one-dimensionality takes for the thing itself. It takes you beyond that toward the becoming of the thing, what it can and in social case wants to become. So this is the fundamental idea of dialectics that both Adorno and Marcuse work with.
And that idea of dialectics would involve dealing right with contradiction. And he seems to use the term negative thinking synonymously with dialectics. What
And
does he mean by negative thinking and positive thinking? Because someone who is new to one-dimensional man reads that, they might think, "Geez, Marcuse, geez, Adorno, why are you so negative?"
well,
What are these
it's,
categories for them?
positive thinking is the empirical thinking. It's the thinking of the thing as it is in its present form, apart from its connections and its future. That's the positive. And this term positive comes from Comte. It comes from 19th century ideas about science that still prevail. The use of the term positive is a bit strange nowadays. I guess it was less so in 1880, but this is the idea. If you see the world as simply what it is in the present, in its empirical givenness, is positive. To see it in terms of all the connections and developments will annul its present form, is to think negatively. So the negativity comes, of course, as the opposite of the positive. But it doesn't just mean being negative, it means understanding that what is not, right? It is not because it is about to become something else, and it is contingent on other things. It's not in itself, it's always related. And of
You're
course, in relation to social institutions, negativity can take a positive form. I mean, that's paradoxical, but it can take a form of resistance, of refusal, of a demand that the thing become what it can become rather than remaining what it is, which is, for example, what we would like this capitalist world to do. And want it to move into another phase in which it is a different kind of world.
we are often used to thinking of potentials or things as an essence that has potentials contained within it,
Mm.
and that the external circumstances of the world or historical events are impediments that prevent us from realizing potentials. But correct me if I'm mistaken, it seems that the way Marcuse through Hegel thinks of potentiality is rather that circumstances in history are the process in which these inner potentials are actually tested, in which they actually become real, or they whether they're actually potentials or not.
Yes. Again, it's the difference with Aristotle, right? The potentials aren't in the thing, potentials are in its connections, in its relations. The potentials belong to the thing through the complexity of the social world in which it exists. Not big. So if you take the university as an example, what is it? It is now what Clark Kerr called the multi-university, the multiversity, a business-oriented, technology-oriented operation in which the humanities are a little sort of fig leaf that allows people to think that they're actually in a academic world, which is when in fact that world has been completely eroded by the transformations of the university system. So is there a possibility of restoring some other way of life in the university? What would that mean? How would that operate? There are people who, of course, want that and argue for it, and they write books about it, and they even sometimes go on strike about it. So there is actually, it's not like it's just a utopia that in a book somewhere that's completely unreal. There's there are forces that are pushing toward this and the potentiality of the university to become once again a place of learning that it used to be. But those potentials are weak compared to the forces that are driving the university toward ever more technical and capitalistic forms. So this is social struggle, right? Social struggle is about trying to revive or make alive potentialities that are not unreal, but they are marginalized in the actual thing itself.
Right. So in other words, the every conjuncture contains seeds of its negation, of its
Yes.
undoing.
Right.
Right. Have you seen the movie recently called well, it's not recent, Hail Caesar?
Oh, that's silly.
Yeah,
Uh,
they have this
it's
scene with
ridiculous.
depicting Marcuse where he says, "The dialectic,"
Yeah.
and there's
Well, that has nothing to do with Marcuse.
no, it's so
They
silly.
just use his name for somebody, some imaginary person who has no connection to him. Marcuse was very different from the kind of Stalinist that is portrayed in the.
Right, yeah. Well, in that they give this obscure example of using funding from Hollywood to fund the revolution, and that's how capitalism's contradictions are undoing capitalism. And they use that's kind of what they were trying to allude to, and yeah, of course, it's just a meme. But I guess speaking of jokes, memes that are relevant to this discussion, I think probably the ultimate example, the epitome of one-dimensional thought was the debate. I'm not sure if you were able to, if you heard about this, but it was back in 2016 when there was this debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, who by tragedy are considered the most famous public intellectuals of our time. But well, they had this debate, and Sam Harris, representing sort of the positivist view, was saying truth is just what a thing is. We just measure, and truth is deduced by science. And Peterson takes this more skeptic approach where he says, "Well, we don't know what truth is." And Jordan Peterson, he settles on American pragmatism as a solution because he thinks truth is so complex. We should just basically treat truth as something that is useful to us. And interestingly, there's this perspective has been repopularized a lot in the modern era. I think is part of the ideology of self help. But of course, pragmatism, John Dewey, mainly William James. What is Marcuse's critique of one dimensionality? How would that critique respond to someone who is convinced that pragmatism is the way? Because we've already are kind of addressed why positivism is problematic.
Yeah.
What is wrong with the pragmatist view?
There is there's something, Dewey was a socialist and he was also very much influenced by Hegel. And there's certainly a lot more commonality between Dewey and Marcuse than between Dewey and Jordan Peterson. Oh,
I think I would say more William James, but Dewey is just usually thrown in there as with pragmatism. Um,
yes. Well, Dewey's a
but
pragmatist.
more the idea that yeah, well, that truth is what is useful to you,
Yeah. And
and that
the
seems kind of at odds with the Frankfurt School critique of instrumental rationality.
truth is what is useful to you. I mean, that's completely absurd. Truth is truth. It might not be useful to you, but if you understand it, then perhaps you can make something of your life. I don't know, unless the problem is that the term useful could mean so many different things. If it When I think of technical artifacts, for example, they're useful in a very simple minded way that makes no sense at all if you're thinking about truth. If you think of useful in some more obscure way, like, you know, that has to do, say, with the development of a person, it's useful for a person, for example, to find out what their true abilities are. Everyone knows that. There's nothing wrong with that as a way of thinking about truth, but it's very vague. It certainly doesn't help very much in your epistemologic endeavors. So I guess I'm just usually when people think about pragmatism and the concept of truth, it's true they're thinking about James and the idea that there's some sort of instrumental or operational aspect to truth. And that I think is only that's only really right for the natural world, for technology, for things of that sort. It makes no sense, our understanding our own person, our own life, our own society. There are many other considerations that have to be taken into account to think about what we mean by truth in those contexts.
I guess to play devil's advocate is people who adopt pragmatism as their worldview tend to do so almost as a justification out of the fundamental problems of philosophy for practical purposes, I guess, hence the pragmatism, because they'll think, why should we care what truth really is? We don't know objective truth. There's all these complexities to truth. I don't want to be like Heidegger and Husserl and debate whether a chair is a chair. I just want to better my life for God's sake. So people Well, and, you could say it's anti-intellectual. It is in many ways, but the that view that of objective the complexity of truth, I think, comes from a confusion and a way to just say, well, truth will just be what is useful in a real consequential way for my life. Now, I think for people like that, how would a dialectical understanding of truth be superior philosophically?
Well, it's the problem is when you say what's useful for my life, what do you mean by your life? Do you even know what you mean by your life? But mostly, I guess people would operationalize the concept of my life in this pragmatic way in terms of money. My life is better if I have more money. So for me, what's useful is truth is whatever helps me to obtain more money. That's not a good way of understanding life. That's pathetic, actually.
That's now I'm really curious as to why John Dewey is a pragmatist, given that he's influenced by Hegel and that he was a socialist. Because I've only read Experience in Education, but I haven't actually read
Mhm.
anything to do with his like more complex philosophy.
Well, I can't explain Dewey to you. It's been a long time since I've read him. Uh, I
Fair
think
enough.
I think Dewey had ideas about. He used this notion of pragmatism to talk about science and understanding science and technology, and he thought the social world also had could be understood through experimental method. So he had a kind of scientific idea of how to improve the social world, and that notion was, of course, completely the opposite of what the Frankfurt School was thinking about. And somehow he managed to squeeze socialism into that idea. And that I think is quite implausible. But he thought, like you could have a scientific type of experiment in the social world in order to better improve social systems, things like that, which isn't stupid. I mean, you could actually, in
Yeah,
Europe,
that's very
people
much in
think,
Lenin's thought too, because Lenin liked Taylorism as a
yeah,
method of transition.
yeah, yeah. There was a great faith in science in the early part of the 20th century as a kind of opposition to religious superstition and conservatism, traditional conservatism, not the kind we have now. And that made some sort of sense in the context of the New Deal, which was a kind of experiment on reorganizing American society. But I think in the wider frame of reference that the Frankfurt School embraces, which includes the whole of modern history, and it's risky to start thinking in the scientific way because it easily merges into a one-dimensional view of society in which phrases "there's nothing." What is it? Margaret Thatcher said, "There's no society,
There's no
society
alternative.
with no alternative." Yeah,
There's no such thing as
um,
society. Yeah, that's what she said.
yeah. But the idea that there's no alternative would could easily morph into the notion that, well, we have to just try and tinker with what we've got because there's no fundamental change possible. And if that's all you think, I mean, there's nothing wrong with tinkering, but if that's all you're willing to do, then you have definitely gone outside the bounds the Frankfurt School wants you to enter.
Some who are listening to this might be confused because Karl Marx, of course, professes that the kind of socialism him and Engels put forth is that of a scientific socialism as opposed to a utopian socialism. And of course, Marcuse considered himself a Marxist, a Hegelian Marxist, of
Yeah.
course, with his own spin, but very much a Marxist in his view of history and takes a lot of inspiration from him. So, in what way does what is Marcuse's Marx, and
First,
how does he settle this science?
let me say something about scientific Marxism, the idea of
Right.
Marxism over science. This is an idea that was counterposed in the 19th century to what was called utopian socialism. So there was scientific socialism, that was Marxism, and then there was utopian socialism. Utopian socialism was not intended to be real. It wasn't, the idea was simply to create the image of a beautiful and perfect society, regardless of whether it could ever be created. And that was, of course, an interesting thing to do. We still read utopian socialists like Thomas More with interest, but it's not part of a political program of some sort. What Marx thought he could do was, by understanding capitalism, or figure out how you could get beyond capitalism to socialism as a real social movement, as a real movement of history, not just a ideal that would look good in paper, but a real thing. And he called this scientific because he was using the terms of 19th century science as they were understood then to talk about society. He was one of the people who created the modern social sciences. But note, social science in this sense, and Marx would have accepted that this term, I think, is not the same thing as natural science. The methods are different. The object is very different. So we're not talking here about making about science in the sort of quasi-technological sense we think about, improving things through technical innovation. We're not talking about cryptocurrency or something like that. We're talking about science in a very broad sense. And this is clear, for example, in Engel's work, where he makes a distinction between different kinds of sciences, which have different objects and different methods. There's never in Engels any thought of, for example, physical reductionism, everything ultimately being atoms and void. He doesn't think like that. He thinks there are independent sciences. For example, biology has its own laws. It's not the same as physics. It can't be reduced to physics. So if we understand science in this way, then we can say, yes, Marxism is a science, but obviously not in the everyday sense we use the term today, in this 19th century sense. Now, Marcuse would have agreed with that, but he'd, of course, also say, be careful that you don't just fall into some kind of scientific reductionism when you talk of Marxism as a science. So his Marxism was based on a different object, a different kind of object that you'd have to treat with different kinds of means from the objects of physics and chemistry and biology, a social object. Right? And of course, you want to understand that object in a way that has validity, that has rational validity. It's not just talk or fantasy. So you want to understand, for example, how the capitalist economy operates and how that affects the way people live, their inequalities that it produces, and so on. All of this needs to be studied and understood in a social scientific, not natural scientific way. But that's not the whole story for Marcuse. And I don't think it was for Marx. For Marx, there was always this thought the system had a potential to transform into something very different, socialism. And that's true for Marcuse as well. The problem for Marcuse, which is different from Marx, is that he doesn't see the agent, the historical agent, capable of making that happen. And I don't think we do either. We don't know how that can happen. That doesn't mean we should give up the idea, but it's not easy to see the path leading to that outcome.
Some people who are critics of Hegel, most famously Deleuze, Foucault, a lot of the post-structuralists, but Althusser, a big critic of Hegel, and people who might just be listening, they might say, "Well, sure, there's this distinction between social science and natural science, but there's this teleology in Hegel and Marx
Mhm.
that, of course, in very real ways, and the way it's been applied by communist parties, to assume that the victory of socialism is inevitable." And there's sometimes still that way of thinking is still around. Now, and obviously, Marcuse doesn't think it's inevitable because he's analyzing why it didn't happen. That's why the Frankfurt School do did what they did, right? So, if there is something still in Hegel, though, that there is this idea that society is negate. There's society contains this inherent negation, and there's this historical unfolding of a process. And if one's a Hegelian and a Marxist, the logical conclusion of that is that socialism is inevitable, is it not? Because I'm asking you to sort of address this teleology question, because this
Yeah.
is often the basis where so many dismiss Hegel and Marx due to this sort of teleology unfolding. Because the way when I read Marcuse, I don't get the feeling that he thinks it's inevitable. But it's
But
yeah.
a dialectical necessity is not the same as a mechanical necessity. When you run out of gas, your car stops. That's a mechanical necessity. Dialectics is different. It's about, again, back to potentiality. It's about what is potentially possible. But in the case of Marxism, that potentiality can only be activated through a social movement. It's not going to come because, say, there's some new change in the way stocks are listed on the stock exchange. It's not going to come because Elon Musk has figured out a new way to make capitalism work. Sorry, that's just not the way it works. The potential is there, but it can only be activated by a mass movement capable of overthrowing the dominant powers. Now, at one point, Marx thought maybe in England, where there was no standing army, hardly any standing army, and long traditions of democracy, perhaps you could have a transition to socialism propulsed by a mass movement and by democratic means without a violent revolution. But for the most part, he thought that the governments of Europe and Russia would have to be overthrown, and that could then initiate a new phase of history. But in any case, only through a mass movement could you hope to get from capitalism to socialism. I mean, you could have a dictatorship of some sort, but it would not produce socialism. It would produce what happened in Russia, this kind of basically what Lenin actually called it this, a form of state capitalism. So I think that the issue here is is there a teleology involved in this process?
Yeah, and
Yes.
is the revolutionary subject preordained? Because that is the whole real Althusserian criticism is Althusser doesn't think history necessarily has a subject, whereas in Hegel, some subjects have to embody the world spirit, right? The zeitgeist of the time, and
Yes.
for Marx, the subject that is ushering in the revolutionary change is the proletariat. And Marcuse is confused because that doesn't appear to be the case anymore, and is looking for a new subject. And that's sort of what I'm addressing. Is there ever actually a subject necessarily in history? 'Cause
Well,
that's the people who are critical of that tend to espouse that sort of position.
the Althusserian position, as I understand it, and I haven't spent a lot of time with him in recent years. I just actually did read some of his stuff on Gramsci. It seems to me incoherent. He seems to think that the revolution will happen without anybody actually wanting it to happen or knowing that it's going to happen. There is no subject. It's just going to happen. And then, of course, we'll have these communists who will help us to make sense of what's going on. People like him. But this has this doesn't really sound like history. History doesn't happen by accident. The people who made the French Revolution maybe didn't understand exactly what was going on and what they were doing, but they had an idea. Come on, they didn't just sort of pop out of the woodwork with a fantasy. They had an idea what they were doing, and it made some kind of sense. And certainly a socialist revolution would have to be of the same nature. The people who, you know, in Victor Serge's book on the first year of the revolution, there's an interesting discussion about the revolution of 1905. According to Serge, the revolution of 1905 started out when workers in the printing presses demanded to be paid the same amount punctuation that they were paid for letters. Okay? That's a completely insignificant occasion. But for some reason, it struck a chord with other workers in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and the movement spread and became a general strike. And then the railway workers went on strike. And then the peasants started to assassinate their landlords. And pretty soon you had a revolution. And in the midst of all this, there must have been somebody who knew what was going on, maybe some social democrats, of whom there were a few thousand in Russia in 1905. But there was no revolution. It ended, you know, you needed the mass to have much more education, and not necessarily book education, political education, to know what they were fighting for, to know why they were there. You didn't want them to go out as revolutionaries in 1905 did with candles asking the little papa, the czar, to listen to their demands. You had to know what you were doing. So, I mean, I think that's in the nature of the Marxist idea of revolution. It's not like, if I understand Althusser's notion, it's not like that at all. And it's interesting because Althusser wrote all this stuff just before the 1968 movement in France, in which I was there, and we did know what we were doing. We had a very good idea that we were an agent of revolution and we were attempting to overthrow capitalism. We weren't just people who had complaints. This was, of course, it started out like the typographers, the students who had complaints about what
Just clarify that for a second. You were in France
in
in
68.
May '68.
Yeah.
He's been
Yeah.
around.
Yes, I have. The initial complaint was that the students in the Nanterre University near Paris wanted to have access to the dorms where the girls were. So it originally started with a complaint about the visiting hours in the dorms. And it ballooned like the 1905 thing, except instead of going with candles to ask the Tsar for help, the Tsar being General de Gaulle, we tried to overthrow the state. So, I mean, that's a revolution. I don't know what Althusser was doing at the time, but surely he must have been impressed by the fact that something was happening. Although, of course, many communists thought it was a disaster. The Communist Party at that time was not really into revolution, not in France. So I think the point is that there's a teleology involved in human affairs. To say that there isn't is bizarre. Of course, there's a teleology, and that would apply to the case of trying to transform the social system. Absolutely. So there must be an agent, and it must have some understanding, maybe not a good understanding, perfect understanding, but some understanding that it's trying to accomplish a change in the system. So I can't make any sense of the idea that Marxism would somehow be wrong because it includes a teleological element. And that's in the nature of human existence.
I think the origin of where such critiques arise has a lot to do with the way that dialectical materialism as an ideology was used by the Soviet Union and, still by many Marxists to this day, because it's not so much just that there's a teleology in the sort of bastardization of Marxism and the way that people respond to that. The assumption is that even the revolutionary subjects are preordained and that there needs to be the right movement. And if it didn't happen, it wasn't the right time and place. Because what is interesting is the way that dialectical materialism was retroactively used by the Stalinist regime to kind of say that everything that ever was done happened because it needed to happen. And that's the way that some Marxists who actually defend everything the Stalin did
Yeah.
use those sort of arguments. Now, this is not a huge side of the left, but they exist and they kind of are recreate that same logic that exists then. And there's what they sort of say. They'll say, well, you had all these countries trying to overthrow the Soviet Union, and you had all of these imperialist encirclement, you had underdevelopment, you had the preparation for the war effort. And the difficulty there is that all those things are real and true, but where do you draw the line between justifying everything that ever happened, saying that it needed to happen regardless of choice? Because they would say, "Oh, if you say, oh, well, you could have chosen not to, kill as many people in the purges." They'll say, "Well, no, because of the circumstances made it so that it led to this." That's where these criticisms arise, and that they still do exist. And I mean, they have their basis kind of in Engels' own writing, because in Dialectics of Nature, he has that weird sort of almost mystical view of human history, that everything that happened right leading up to Bismarck, to Europe and bourgeois revolutions, it was inevitable. You see that in his writing. So I don't think it's necessarily a crazy leap to see how the Stalinists view historical materialism in that way.
That I
I don't dismiss Marx on that base, but I'm just trying to
Yes.
argue the devil's advocate for the people who do, just so we can refute it in a dialectical way.
That view of dialectics was common in Russia in the 19th century. And I guess the Russian communists picked it up and found it useful for justifying their actions. But I don't think is, it's not, I don't think that that's a mechanical idea of history, right? That the causes explain everything. So there's essentially no teleology. Everything is explained by prior causes. That makes no sense, though, for Marxism, because Marxism is about what Marx called, this is a quote, human control of history. The whole idea is that human beings will finally be able to make their own history.
You're
According
not a post-humanist. You're a Marxist humanist.
I don't really, I'm not sure what exactly I'm being asked to ascribe to.
Or even
Uh,
if you subscribe to this binary. But that is often where people say that, "Oh, well, this is the young Marx thinks."
no, this is the late Marx who's saying it's about human control of history. The point is that, I mean, what capitalism has done is to create a new kind of ruling class and a new kind of working class. This is new in all of human history. For the first time, people are able, Marx says in the manifest, to understand the world. They can, with their senses, figure out what's going on around them. And once they gain that understanding, they can change the world. And they can change it according to their possibilities and desires rather than simply being victims of the next phase in history, whatever that might be. That's Marxism. People who don't think that's Marxism, I have got a problem. They've lost the the thread. That's the
The
whole
threat of the
idea.
Enlightenment, right?
Well, this is the whole idea. Just to think of Marxism as some kind of mechanism, mechanical system in which automatically history will automatically move from one phase to the next because of so-called contradictions is not Marxism. So the basic problem that Marx is dealing with is how do you move from one phase of history to another? And how do you move from a phase of history in which natural laws of the economy prevail over human beings into a new system in which human beings have the ability to organize their own existence? They're not subject to nature or to the economic laws, but they can organize their own existence in a better way. And this requires consciousness. I don't think that there's any doubt that Marx believed there would be some conscious understanding involved in the transformation from capitalism to socialism. It's not going to happen by itself. And I think Engels also believed the same thing. In his essay on the housing question, he explains how the workers who used to be living in the countryside and were subjected to the dominance of the local lords now have become free outlaws in the cities where they work in factories and they can understand what's happening. They have moved from one intellectual sphere to another, essentially quasi-feudal and Christian world to the modern world where they can understand what's going on. That's the basis for the whole thing. So to deny that seems to me to be completely un-Marxist.
Well, of course, the Enlightenment project, is Kant defined it, it was human mastery over himself, like humans being able to have true freedom by being able to not be subordinate to these natural factors and to mythical factors. But then, of course, Adorno talks about how myth already was used to have human control over nature, and how the Enlightenment, if it doesn't, if it doesn't have its own flexibility and reversibility in itself, if it's not self-aware, it can turn into myth and lead to domination as opposed to
Mm,
that. Now, Marcuse, this is where I think it's different between Marcuse and Adorno. Is with Adorno, I don't get a sense that there's any way out. At least it's not very clear with Dialectic of the Enlightenment. His thing is just, yes, he proposes a kind of negative dialectics, which some people would say is already dialectics. But with Marcuse, he does something very different, which I find very confusing, which is he proposes a new sensibility. He wants to move to a
mm.
new form of rationality. What was he doing with this project of new sensibility? Because, of course, he has the book, The Aesthetic Dimension, but he already has traces of this in One Dimensional Man and in other books and in Counter Revolution and Revolt, too.
Yeah, Adorno was much more pessimistic than Marcuse, as was Horkheimer. Horkheimer was even worse. There's an interesting dialogue between Horkheimer and Adorno in the 1950s about the disappearance of the communist movement and the need to create a new communist movement. But they are pretty clear that they don't have any idea how that can happen. And at one point, Horkheimer says, "What are we doing then?" And Adorno says, "Perhaps we are creating a message in a bottle for future times." So that's their idea. That's Adorno's idea.
Was
In
that in
other
towards
words,
the new manifesto,
yeah,
the
yes,
interviews or the
yeah,
dialogues?
yeah.
I have
It's
to
also
read that.
funny that in that dialogue, they also, at one point, they make fun of Marcuse. So what Adorno and Horkheimer are saying there is, even though we have no idea how socialism might be created, we're not going to give up. We'll put our message in a bottle and leave it for future generations. It's still right, even though we don't have. Now, why would they say that? Because, of course, are they back to utopian socialism? No, since they have no agent. I think the answer is because of what it does to you as a human being to give up. Once you know that this possibility is there, you have to preserve it, even if you preserve it only in your own mind, because the alternative is to become a conformist rat. That's their view. Okay. And I think Marcuse will, of course, have the same view. What's different about them is that in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, when we were creating the new left in the US, students in Germany and France and Italy were, and Germany and Britain were doing the same. So Japan, there was a new possibility of movement, of some kind of movement towards socialism. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer responded negatively to this. And I'm astonished that there are still leftists today who are so committed to Adorno that they even believe in his silly things about jazz. And they love what he has to say about how bad the new left was. This is ridiculous.
Oh, I know
Adorno
exactly who you're talking about.
Yeah, Adorno is certainly worth studying, and but you can learn a lot, but you can't accept everything. I mean, come on. He isn't a prophet. He's just
Well,
an
to be
intellectual
fair,
thinker.
some people, they just like to say the new left failed, and we have to accept that, and they see permutations of the new left in today's left that
But
are
that's
making the same mistakes. That's kind of
yeah,
their
that
position, I
that's
think.
all true. That's all true, but it has nothing to do with Adorno deciding to call the police on the students who occupied his seminar. Come on. Oh,
Yeah, or Horkheimer was even worse. Horkheimer support the Vietnam War?
yes. So so
Yeah, but
so
Marcuse's
the
new
point here
new,
is
reason.
point here is that Marcuse had a positive relationship to the New Left. He was there in California and he could see it happening. And it was maybe it was different from what the Germans saw in France, but it was clearly a very important social movement that included the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, feminist movement. All these things were happening, and toward the late end of his life, the environmental movement. All these things were happening around Marcuse, and he took it seriously. Of course, he knew there were all sorts of problems, there were sillinesses of all sorts, but there was also a fundamental desire to change the system, to no longer create wars, to no longer subjugate workers and Black people. And he saw in the New Left possibilities. Now, what he called the aesthetic sensibility, his new sensibility, was what he meant by that was that in the New Left, you could see that people didn't just have opinions. It wasn't just that they didn't like the prevailing politics. They had a feeling about it. It was somatic. It was part of their who they were. And this feeling, this inner command, desire to move beyond a system based on consumption, competitive strife, and war, that struck him as something really fundamental and important. This could be the basis for a different social world. This could be the way out from a society that was one dimensionalized by its lovely automobiles, lawnmowers, dishwashers. This could mean that you had other values that went beyond simply getting some consumer goods. And this was a widespread thing. This was not just a few people, who had, of course, there were always intellectuals and bohemians and artists who had other values, but now it had become a mass phenomenon involving millions of people. And that struck him as a really fundamental change. Today, it's sort of strange because a lot of what Marcuse saw as a new sensibility has become part of the cliches of the everyday world now.
I was just about to say it. It became the new sensibility, of the new spirit of capitalism, as some have called it.
Yeah. So certainly elements of that did infiltrate the dominant culture. But that doesn't mean that the people who were struggling against segregation and the war in Vietnam made a mistake or just weren't any good at politics or that there was something wrong with them and that we were much smarter and better than they were. That's stupid. They did their best with all the flaws that you'd expect in humanity, as opposed to something in a book. I've written about the collapse of the New Left, and it was a disaster. There's no doubt about it. And you can easily see the same mistakes being made today, both the mistakes by the countercultural types and the mistakes by the Marxists. And you should learn from those mistakes rather than saying that the New Left was itself a mistake. It'd be better to study of the history and try and talk to people who were there and understand what happened and how to do better this time. So I think Marcuse's argument is valid. There was something really important that happened, a new sensibility, a different way of viewing life. And that is, in fact, essential to any kind of social movement that wants to overthrow a rich society. We're not in the 19th century when poverty was the principal reason why people would revolt. Of course, there are a lot of poor people today, but their poverty today is not of the same ilk as the poverty of people in the 19th century. It's a reason to be dissatisfied, to go on strike if you have to happen to have a union, but it's not the same thing as the savage poverty of workers in the 19th century. What Marx thought would be in the vanguard of the movement. We're talking about a different situation in which, sure, we're in favor of people who go on strike winning their strike. We also understand that is not necessarily going to be the spark that sets off a social revolution. We know what the likely outcome is going to be. So there needs to be something more than simply a desire for better wages, getting people moving. And Marcuse was trying to figure out what that could be through what he saw as the changes in the sensibility of people in the New Left, in the civil rights movement, who had bigger ideas, you know, big ideas. They had big ambitions for the future.
Yeah, talking more about overcoming alienation as a whole and work, the alienation of work, which I see is embodied in a lot of today's movements. Slowly, but we see elements of it. Is that it's also just in everyday life. Most people I know, and in my own experience, what has been the most dissatisfying thing with work is not just being underpaid, but it's the uselessness of it all. Feeling like wasting your life away for no reason. That is
Those are new left sentiments.
right. Exactly. Yeah. That well,
The
that's
sensibility.
yeah, that's why I have a huge, I guess you could say, that's why I mean that's why Marcuse resonated with me in a certain way that maybe classical Marxism also made me understand the world, but didn't quite resonate with me in the
Yeah.
same way. Now, Marcuse proposes a sort of way of this alternative consciousness, and he talks about a new type of reason. He says, "What is freedom is reason, or as a reason is freedom." I might be getting it backwards, but the whole idea of purpose of freedom would be to develop these human faculties like reason. Now, what is that exactly? Because and how do we, more importantly, which is the part that we haven't addressed, which is how do we actually raise this consciousness? Because people often now, due to the aftermath of the new left, their eyes often roll when they hear stuff like consciousness raising, or if they are, you deal with this in your book when you talk about does Marcuse want a world ruled by philosopher kings? I have my speculation regarding this, but I'll save that for after. Is because I want you to lay out your view of this, is to how Marcuse, maybe how you disagree, if you agree or disagree, how we can transform this consciousness. Because a lot of people, when they hear that, they think it means a vanguardist elite or educational dictatorship, as Rousseau
Yeah.
calls it.
Well, you raised the question of the relation of freedom to reason. That's a very big question, but fundamental question. And Marcuse treats that as an ontological question. And I think it might be really a bit difficult to go into that at the same time as we talk about the problem of consciousness.
Well, maybe
So,
we can get into that before, because I think some people will say, well, what consciousness are we trying to raise exactly? Right? What does this look like? Because some people, I mean, it is a confusing question because what does that look like? Like, what is the alternative consciousness? I mean, we alluded to that with the new left sentiments,
mhm.
but I mean, as we saw, that has elements of that have been co opted into capitalism. So, I mean, what is that consciousness and the reason? Because obviously it is what Marcuse was envisioning is not what is in late capitalism today.
I'm getting I'm having trouble here combining all these things in one
Yeah, we'll
package.
do one at a time. We'll do
It,
this
it's,
the reason and freedom relation and that new
so
consciousness.
the most fundamental level of that has to do with the fact, as human beings, we live in a world which is organized by meanings. Everything we see and interact with has a meaning for us. And we move in that world freely in the sense that we can decide where we want to go, what we want to do. We're not bound by instinct. An animal bound by instinct doesn't have the flexibility that we have with the concepts and with the meanings that we live. Those meanings can be changed. They have a historical background, a cultural background of some sort. They're not simply, we don't move mechanically from one thing to another according to instinct. But we live in a world. And this concept of world, Marcuse gets ultimately from Heidegger and Husserl. It's a phenomenological concept. And freedom is and reason are combined because reason is realm of concepts, and it is we are free in the sense we can deploy these concepts, develop them, and live by them. So reason requires freedom. It is not bound by instinct. And reason is realm of concepts through which we understand the world and attribute meaning to it. So this is very abstract. This is, fundamental ontology and very different than from the more specific question of what is meant by consciousness in the context of social movements. Well, I think that is a difficult question also, but it's a very different question. It presupposes, of course, the fact that we are rational beings and free beings in the ontological sense, but it's a specification, you might say, of that. And I'm not sure that Marcuse actually is the place to go to think about that question of consciousness. He observed it. I mean, first he saw the, the loss of a potentiality in the working class as it became co-opted into capitalism by the consumer society. And he saw it return in the new left with the new sensibility, the ability to see beyond the given toward a better world. But he didn't actually have a theory of how you would develop that consciousness and what, say, political movements, let's say he didn't have a theory, for example, of the party and things of that sort. So he talked about that stuff in the 1940s, but, by the time the new left was around, it was no longer, and by then it was a different world, right? So I think we need really different sources to get into the question of consciousness. But certainly Marcuse would not have believed in intellectuals taking over or something like that. He rejects that idea. He discusses the problem in Eros and Civilization. He says when Rousseau talked about a educational dictatorship, this is in the 18th century, right? It made some sort of sense because the mass of the population was completely uneducated. But today, he says that does no longer make sense. You have to have a democratic movement in order to change society. So he's, I think, quite clear that this is the change in consciousness has to come from the people. But I mean, again, doesn't mean he doesn't think intellectuals have no role. Of course they have a. And there's a funny place where Lenin says people are saying that we intend to rule as intellectuals over the people. He says, in fact, the people have something to tell us. Obviously, it wasn't intellectuals who created the new left. That came from below. And intellectuals maybe could add some useful information about things like the nature of imperialism that might not be obvious to everyone, even though they were appalled at the slaughter in Vietnam. Be useful to know more about imperialism if you're going to go out and demonstrate against the Vietnam War. So intellectuals have a role, but that's not the same thing as a dictatorship of intellectuals. Marcuse would not have thought that made any sense.
Yeah, certainly he's quite clear in some of the speeches as well, where he says there can't even be a revolutionary party without a revolutionary mass.
Yeah.
And but still, some people who oppose the idea of a vanguard entirely. And I don't think Marcuse wanted a dictatorship of intellectuals, but I think it's hard to read his work and not see that the logical conclusion of it is some kind of vanguardism, which I'm not inherently opposed to. I think we need leadership, we need discipline, but it has to be accountable and has to be democratic accountability to it. But there's there is people say, because Marcuse himself did say he was a libertarian socialist. Now some people take that to mean anarchistic, but when I read One Dimensional Man, I feel like the logical conclusion it is a little tough to grapple with. And I'm gonna quickly just read a quote which you're already familiar with, but for the
Mhm.
audience, at the end of One Dimensional Man, when he says, "The mere absence of all advertising and all indoctrinating media of information and entertainment would plunge the individual into a traumatic void where he would have the chance to become an instrument of progress, and it is one which, like others in the established societies, is methodologic." Why to skip there? Jesus. Well, basically, he says man will have to learn his ABCs again, but that if deprived of all indoctrinating media,
Yeah.
he'll have to
You
basically
know,
learn how to think. He'll have to develop his human faculties, and that's scary. And,
Marcuse was a provocateur. Unlike Adorno and Horkheimer, who were very stern, and Marcuse had a sense of humor. And he liked to push things to the point where you could maybe understand something that you wouldn't have otherwise grasped, even if it meant saying something that was, not really convincing, not really. So, for example, the whole of his book on repressive tolerance is a kind of a shaggy dog story. The whole book is about how you need to understand that liberal tolerance was already intolerant of feudalism and its ideologies, and the socialist movement would have to be intolerant of capitalism. And you can go through the whole thing, and then you get to the end, and he says, "Well, after all, that's impossible. So we better just try and work for a more democratic society." So it's why did he put us through that? Well, because he wanted us to understand the to get a sense of just how bad things were, just how difficult it is to achieve anything like a fair public opinion in our society, just how difficult it is for anything to get through that isn't prefabricated by the system, you know? And
yeah,
so,
and in Counter Revolution or Revolt, he has this polemic against direct democracy where he says, "Well, what if people vote
well,
wrong?" Basically.
well, in 1919, he was drafted, 1918, he was drafted into the army, and they sent him to Berlin. I mean, I guess he lived in Berlin, so he was sent there to the military in Berlin, and he joined. And then the soldiers revolted in the midst of the collapse of the regime, and there was a revolution in parts of Germany, and he was part of that. He was in the Soldiers' Council, sort of the Soviet of Berlin Revolution, and was astonished and disappointed when when the soldiers re-elected their old officers. So all those Prussian reactionaries who'd been stomping on them before suddenly were back in power. And I think as a result, he never trusted the people. In fact, he used to make fun of it. He'd say, "Down with the people."
I
He
see
would
that
think,
I totally see that too, that there is a kind of elitism in Marcuse, which I don't think is unwarranted because
"Oh,
it has
What's
that we
happening?
actually cannot be naive when it comes to stuff like direct democracy, because in Chile, they recently voted against a highly progressive constitution that would have replaced the Pinochet
Yeah.
constitution. And yeah, I mean, I like that you grappled with that in your book, because sometimes people either like to gloss over that, or or people who have this sort of, I think, dogmatic anti-elitism, dare I say, will dismiss Marcuse and people like Adorno on that basis.
I think the problem is that there are no angels. It's simple. And the angels aren't people who rule us, and they aren't the people who they rule. You have to have standards of some sort. You have to have some idea, and you can gain that idea not just through fantasy, but through history. We have a long history. You can go back to Spartacus if you're really anxious to figure it out. We know what it means to fight for a more just and equal and better society because of the history of people fighting for it. And so you're not stuck with having to simply accept whatever the people happen to want at the moment. People as a concept are different from any particular group that at any one time might think that, say, Trump is their solution. So, yeah, you could call that elitist, but I think it's the kind of elitism that is bound. Well, it's not an elitism of governance. The point isn't that these people want to rule. The point is they want the people to appear, the right people to appear, the people who actually belong to that long history of struggles for a better world. And when those people appear, that's when you can have a revolution. You certainly can't have it because a party or a group of intellectuals will decide that it's time. That's not going to work. That was tried in Russia and it didn't work very well because I mean, again, you could argue all you want about the conditions under which they were operating. But if you know the history, I mean, Lenin thought that they were making the revolution so that the Russian regime would not be able to stop the German revolution that Marcuse was participating in Berlin. They were storing grain in a famine in Russia so they could send it by train to Germany to save the revolution in Germany. They didn't think they were going to do what actually happened. They thought they were doing something entirely different. They were part of the world revolution. So what happened in Russia was very different from their expectations. And it did have some of the problems of an elite bureaucracy trying to manage and dominate the man. But that's not what Marcuse was interested in. He was interested in the people themselves coming capable of gaining what Marx called human control of history.
And how does that happen without a sort of elite, or even if it's, I think, democratic elite at least, but because then, like you said, the rights people, right? Marcuse is very against moral relativism, and that
Yeah.
shines throughout One Dimensional Man, something I particularly like. He obviously thinks there is like a truth and there is correct ideas. And would that not logically mean a sort of elite, but it would be one connected to the people? What I'm trying to say here is that I think, for according to Marcuse's own thoughts, something like anarchism or horizontalism is kind of impossible. That the
Marcuse,
solution is neither in like absolute verticalism or absolute elite, like in the party deciding everything, party of intellectuals, but a sort of middle ground between that and horizontalist anarchism. Because I feel like so many people who saw the experience of the Soviet Union went to stuff like Tony Negri's Empire in the 90s and thought the answer was a multitude of spontaneous, horizontally organized protests, and that hasn't seemed to lead the left anywhere in the past 20 years.
there's several different things going on here. I don't think that all those spontaneous protests were a waste. I think they were the only thing going that made for any kind of progress in the last 20 years. And they made a big difference. If you think of it in terms of 50 years or 70 years, You can see obviously there's a huge difference. Just the fact, for example, that there are women professors in your university. You could find out how many there were in 1970. I bet there were two, if that many. So there are huge changes that have come about because of these spontaneous movements. But that's not quite the same thing as talking about the overthrow of the whole system. And even in those movements, there were various forms of leadership. And those forms of leadership were really essential for the success of those movements. And intellectuals played a role. It's hard to imagine the women's movement without the famous text all the women read, Simone de Beauvoir and all the other feminist scholars who made such an impact in the 1970s and 80s. So I think Marcuse was realistic. He had a realistic view of social movements. He thought they would have to be led. But this is a separate question from the concept of truth. There's a funny kind of liberal way of thinking about truth. And somehow, if you believe that there's some truth, then you're a dictator because you're saying that this is the truth, and therefore everyone has to agree with you. But that makes no sense at all. If nobody, so I mean, one of the effects of that liberal ideology is that you don't hold any view at all, because that would be dictatorial, and you don't want to be a dictator. But
Well, isn't
that's
that like in Karl Popper's whole debate with Marcuse's? He thinks, despite whatever Marcuse says, he's anti-pluralist because he's a Hegelian who believes in
that's
ultimate totality, and that's what they love to say.
that's all bullshit. Marcuse was perfectly willing to debate with other people. He knew what he thought was the truth, and he was prepared to hold forth on that and try and convince others. But he was also willing to listen to other people. I remember at UCSD during the war in Vietnam, he had a debate with another scholar, another professor in the university about Vietnam. They had a public debate. So the fact that you hold something to be true doesn't mean that you hold it to be absolute and that everybody else should just bow down before you. That's a strange idea. Of course, you have to have your own ideas. Otherwise, you're nobody. But that doesn't mean that you're impervious to discussion with other people and unable to learn from them as well as
Mhm.
convincing them. So these are just common sense things that Marcuse, like most people, would argue. Social movements require some kind of leadership, but it shouldn't be dictatorial. Everyone should know their own truth and be willing to put it forth, but that doesn't mean that they won't listen to others and learn from them. These are just common sense ideas, and strange that they become debatable.
Well, a lot of right wingers like to point out repressive tolerance, which you brought up. That
Mhm.
Marcuse, you know, talks about the essentially censoring certain far right ideas and saying, well, how can a free society tolerate such unfree ideas like fascist ideas? And of course, he's getting death threats from the Ku Klux Klan and he's confused why they're allowed to do what they do. And yeah, I mean, so people point to that. They say that Marcuse ultimately is against free speech. That's what usually his critics like to say.
Yeah. But again, as I said, if you get to the end of the essay, which of course these people never do, most of them probably have never read it. If you get to the end of the essay, you see that what he says is we're in a situation where tolerance is essential. Democratic rights are essential. That's we need to move toward more rather than less, and that would so. But you know,
But the way one can still read that is that it's essential for
he's
us,
trying. Yeah,
but once we're in power, we're gonna ban all you. That's how I could still see them reading it.
yes, that's the provocation that's supposed to get you thinking. You know,
Mhm.
in fact, Marcuse is not wrong in thinking some restrictions on free speech might be useful. And Europe, which has gone through the experience of the Nazi regime in World War II, there are many countries in which there are restrictions on free speech, restrictions on racist speech, on Nazism as an ideology. And that doesn't seem to prevent people from having a democratic society. I'm not sure that it would be a bad thing for the United States to have some limitations. And in any case, if those limitations were as strictly defined as they are in Europe, they would not prevent us from having a normal democratic polity. So I don't see really, I mean, that's, of course, we're in the United States. This Constitution gives us broad rights of free speech, and that's been useful. It's certainly better than restrictions that would go too far and that would prevent people from talking about things of importance. But it's not the only, that First Amendment is not, God's gift. It just happens to be the way we in the US have managed this problem. People in Europe manage it differently because they had a different historical experience. But so there are different ways of organizing a democracy. I don't think that Marcuse is really, I don't think he really intended that people would be unable to hold opinions that he disagreed with.
Yeah, just of course, we need to have the antithesis be posed so can deal
That's
with
the
that.
idea. Yeah, the
And
idea is sure. What is the meaning of free speech in a society in which the the entire public sphere is completely colonized by one system, one idea, and controlled by corporations that have an interest in that idea? What's the meaning of free speech in such a system where you can send propaganda? Of course, remember, this is during the war in Vietnam, propaganda that gets people excited about murder on a scale of millions. What does that mean? So he's writing a book about that, and people need to understand that. They need to know, and they're not this First Amendment world where everybody's opinion is taken for granted and serious and important. Well, on the contrary, it's a world of total propaganda. That's what he's writing about, and he wants you
it's
to think.
the closing universe of discourse.
Yeah,
And yeah, without getting into a whole debate on free speech, but I'm glad we addressed that because it is the elephant in the room when it comes to Marcuse's legacy. The last thing I wanted to address was something I wanted to address earlier, but it wasn't really the right time. It just really depends how much time we have. But the last thing I wanted to address was Marcuse's Freud. And because, of course, as alluded to earlier, I mean, Marcuse's Freudian book, his Eros and Civilization, is often his most read book nowadays, even the One Dimensional Man, I think, sold more back in the day. So people often read that and they see either because they don't like Freud, they dismiss him because Freud's become quite unpopular these days. And if they're a Lacanian, they tend to find his interpretation of Freud bad. Or if you're a Foucault, you think Freud's whole repression thesis is wrong and you dismiss Marcuse on that basis. And I liked that you addressed Foucault's history of sexuality. So why don't we just quickly go into Marcuse's Freud and some misconceptions regarding that?
yeah. The Foucault is also a provocateur, and in that book on the history of sexuality, he's having fun. And he's everyone thinks that the bourgeoisie was repressive, but actually they were really interested in sex and had all sorts of that's Foucault, right? He's doing what Marcuse was doing in his own way, trying to force you into a new frame of reference where you could see the world in a different way and understand that all that stuff about oppression actually went along with family policies that resulted in huge population growth. So, and of course, prostitution on a huge scale and so on. So in fact, Victorians were not so repressive after all. So Then he makes complaints about the Freudian Marxists like Wilhelm Reich and Marcuse, because they seem to believe that there was a repression. This is just having fun at the expense of people who can't fight back. Well, the fact is that the notion of the one-dimensional man contains a chapter which anticipates Foucault's theory. It's the second chapter, I believe. And in that chapter, Marcuse explains the instrumentalization of sex by capitalist society and how the sex is not pressed, it is channeled, which is exactly Foucault's position. It's channeled in ways that reinforce the system. And that channeling, of course, takes a different form in 1960 than in 1880. But it is fundamentally a form of what he calls repressive desublimation. And by repressive desublimation, he means something very specific that I think is quite similar to Foucault's argument. He means sublimation is pressing the sexual instinct and forcing it into other channels, for example, into work. So the libidinal energy that was supposed to go into sex is instead transferred into work. That's repression. That's 19th century stuff. Now, desublimation, returning the energy back into its original channel. So, in other words, people, instead of obsessing over work, and they would be able to move their energies toward a more free form of sexuality. So that's desublimation. Repressive desublimation would be this desublimated energy that is now available for sexuality is used in order to make the system itself more secure. It's used to bind the individuals more tightly to the system. And this is what Marcuse thought was happening with the obsession with sexuality in the post-war period in the United States. Sexuality was not the liberation of man, human beings, toward a new state of existence. It was simply a part of the consumer culture designed to keep people happy with the system as it was. And so he made fun of a lot of things about, the use of sexy girls on advertising for automobiles, the obsession with the deodorant sprays, cleanliness, and so on, all of which were part of a new form of desublimated oppressive sexuality that became part of the world of consumer culture in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not a Freudian. But there's something very positive about Marcuse's use of Freud. And I think it's still a very interesting book, Eros and Civilization, even if you're not a Freudian, because the basic argument is, I think, still a valid argument, even if you're not a Freudian. The basic argument is that throughout history, most people have had to suppress their desires. And society has enabled them to do that by punishing them if they get too out of line. So most people, most of the time, have been confined to a very narrow range of desires. And as societies have become richer and more people can express themselves in more ways, this desublimation of desire has become less significant. Now, more desires can be expressed. People are able to have a larger life, a life that is more satisfying. This threatens. This still, of course, requires a large amount of sublimation, repression of desire, just less than the past. Marcuse sees this as moving toward the state in which much less repression would be required. But the capitalist system, he argues, requires the repression, requires the repression continue to, because that's part of the organization of competition and struggle and the whole individualistic organization of social life. And so he invented the category of surplus repression. See, we're at a point where repression is slowly diminishing, but the amount of repression is still very high. And it's high because the capitalist system has organized life in such a way as to create surplus repression, more than is technically necessary, given the level of, of welfare that is available. So revolution is about overcoming surplus repression. It doesn't mean there'd be no repression. There'd still be repression, but less than what is in fact required by a civilized society, not the extra amount required by a capitalist version of it. That's an interesting argument. And that's the main argument of Eros and Civilization. So even though I'm
That's
not a
where
fan, I think the book is interesting.
I think this also what generates all the confusion, though, because when he says he does use repression in that Freudian way, repression of desire in Eros and Civilization, whereas in repressive desublimation, I mean, the system really it satisfies those desires, but keeping people in a loop and by nature desublimating those desires so they don't have any revolutionary sublimation
Right.
rather than classical repression. So I think the confusion of repressive is why some people they don't take him seriously because they don't see the different ways he's using repression. But I do think there is truth in the critique of his repression hypothesis in Eros and Civilization because I mean, we look at capitalism today, seems like it's nothing but the expansion of desire, and it seems to prey on that and by,
And that's what he means by surplus, by repressive desublimation.
yes, yeah,
That's his
exactly.
theory. That's his theory. It's not a critique. It's his theory.
Right, but I mean, in the Eros, it seems like he's calling for the liberation of desire, right? And that if we just didn't have so much repression, so when people read that text without one-dimensional man, they think, well, Marcuse is really doing the same thing that, like Zizek, for example. I try to really find what Zizek would said about Marcuse. He doesn't say much of anything other than in one interview in conversations with Zizek, where he says, if there's one book he'd throw in the trash, it would be Eros and Civilization.
You know,
And,
that's
it he says that
on the back of my book. On the back of my book, Zizek writes,
endorse it,
yeah, he says, the ruthless critique of everything existing today is needed more than ever.
which is I'm wondering, so
What
did
we
like
need is to repeat today what Marcuse in his critical critique of traditional Marxism did in the 1960s.
well,
So
that's this
Zizek says a lot of things.
that's what I'm very well, he said this a long time ago. This is a
Yeah,
long time ago when he said that interview. Well, I would really wanna know if Zizek had like, since, assuming he read your book,
yeah,
because we all know Zizek is, you know
he's been,
yeah, but, yeah, like, I wonder if he had like, an epiphany when it comes to Marcuse because he used to be very dismissive, of
yes.
that.
Look, the idea of repressive desublimation was written about in the 1960s, and it had a relatively narrow focus because that was what it. I mean, it was an attempt to make sense of consumer society and the role of sexuality in consumer society. That's the same today. I mean, nothing's changed. Maybe people have smartphones, but they didn't have smartphones in 1964. Therefore, Marcuse is out of date. I mean, that's, come on. Nothing has changed at the level that Marcuse is writing about when he talks about repressive desublimation. So it's just a misunderstanding of his categories because maybe they're complicated and people have not,
Well, it's 'cause
don't
of
have,
Wilhelm Reich and
yeah,
repression is very different from what Reich was doing from Marcuse, and Marcuse
yeah.
even distances himself from Reich in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, right?
Yeah, he used to make fun of me.
Yeah.
He would say it was for Reich, the revolution is all about sex.
Well, it's a lot of people who read Arrows think that. It's seen so many people who are I actually had a professor when I was in grad school who's completely dismissed Marcuse on this basis, on that saying that, "Oh, well, that's just, it's the same critique Foucault gave of him and Reich." And they kinda just they jumble them together, and I think, part of that is due to that why did he use repressive as a term? It's such a I think if he didn't use the word repressive in his
No,
thinking, I
no.
would've
It's only because Foucault made a fuss about the word repressive that people think Marcuse shouldn't have used the word. But it's part of the game of academic one-upsmanship. I think that Foucault didn't believe there was repression. The guy was a homosexual. He didn't believe there was repression. Come on. He believed there was repression. And people like him were heavily repressed. Maybe not so much in France, but certainly in places
but
he
he's
inherited.
born in Vichy, so we probably, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, come on. So, but he found a clever way of making a very important point that repression is not a one-way street. It's not an absolute. Repression is a kind of channeling of desire, not an abolition of desire, but a channeling of desire. And that channeling is socially organized. That's what he was trying to say. And that's a good point. But Marcuse made the same point, just used different terminology.
Yeah, thank you for making me feel less crazy. I remember when I was trying to say that, and it was like, "Are you sure?" Well, I mean, it's pretty yeah, thanks for, I don't know how much time you have, but I was
I'm
gonna
getting tired.
yeah, I was about to end off the show, and I realized we didn't mention the debate as to whether Marcuse abandons Heidegger or not, because you kinda
Ah,
say he goes in favor of Hegel over Heidegger, and, of course, that is that one he wrote that text, Heideggerian Marxism, which I find to be a little bit obscure, probably one of his more harder books to read.
yeah.
Yeah, like, I just if you maybe wanna close that out with his relation to
Yeah.
Heidegger, because, of course, he was a pupil of Heidegger, and he had a very ambivalent relationship with him.
Yes. Yeah, that's a complicated question. He was a Heideggerian of a sort in the late 1920s and early 30s, and he wrote his doctoral, his Habilitathese, it's a kind of super thesis for Heidegger on Hegel. Uh, but of course, it was a little late, and he had to run because of the Nazis. And Heidegger probably never read the thesis, didn't give him his degree. He then wrote an essay when he entered the Frankfurt School. His kind of maiden essay to prove himself, I think, was an essay on totalitarian philosophy, in which he excoriates Heidegger and other right wing thinkers. And so you could get the impression that he was completely independent of Heidegger for thereafter. But I don't think that's correct. I think, in fact, he learned things from Husserl and Heidegger. He studied with both of them. They're both phenomenologists, and he learned things from them which affect his way of thinking for the rest of his life. And it shows up, especially in One Dimensional Man, but in the chapter on, I think it's chapter 6 on technology, where he actually quotes Heidegger and Husserl. And so it's a complicated question because he didn't want to actually come back and rewrite his ideas about Heidegger and Husserl. That was over. That was something he did when he was a kid. But there were still things that he learned from them, and he put them into his later work. So there's two different statements that he made about this, which are contradictory. In the essay with Fred Olson, which is an easily accessible, important essay, he was asked by Olson, who was a Heideggerian, whether he thought there was any influence of Heidegger on his thought any longer. And he said, no. I guess it was, I can't remember the exact terms, but essentially what it amounted to was Heidegger, forget it. But then there's another, and it's a Hungarian guy, I think named Almazi, I'm not sure exactly who, interviewed him a little later. and asked him who were the important philosophers in the 20th century. And he mentions Heidegger. So I think he was ambivalent, you know. He knew that he learned from these guys and made a difference in the way he thought and how he understood his Marxism, which is a kind of phenomenological Marxism, ultimately. On the other hand, he had a bad feeling about Heidegger, who had become a Nazi, who refused to amend his mistake. You know, that for him, I think, was intolerable. I think he was prepared to forgive Heidegger for making the mistake, but not if he refused to make any amends. That's just impossible. And there's a letter, there's an exchange of Heidegger and Marcuse after the war. Marcuse sent Heidegger some help because he was afraid that many people in Germany were having a hard time. They were hungry and cold. And he sent some things from the United States where people were doing well. And then they had an exchange. And he asked Heidegger, basically, he asked Heidegger to say he had made a mistake. And Heidegger wrote back and said, well, you know, what the Germans did was no different from what the Allies did to the Ostdeutschen, the people, the Germans who lived in Poland who were kicked out. So it's all the same, you know. Marcuse wrote back and he said, no philosopher can allow himself to say such a thing. And that was the end. He never contacted Heidegger again. So you
Yeah.
can understand it's a complicated question.
Yeah, and he was also Jewish, right?
Well, yeah, and he had to
That's
flee Germany. And
mhm.
I'm sure he had relatives who were killed. Every
Yeah,
Jewish person in the world has relatives who died, including me. So that makes it hard, you know. On the other hand, Heidegger is more than just the dumb shit who thought that the Nazis were going to solve the problems of the modern world.
yeah,
He's a
hard
lot
to
more than
deny
that.
his influence on philosophy.
Yeah. So it's complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. He didn't Marcuse didn't wanna pull a Hannah Arendt and
Forgive the
reconcile.
guy.
Yeah.
No, he couldn't do that. He couldn't. I think that's reasonable that he didn't.
Mhm.
I think it would. I would not I would not have felt it possible to consort with someone who had functions under the Nazi regime and who thought that that was okay. No, sorry. Of course, it's not the same as to say that he was a murderer. He didn't kill people,
Yeah.
but he could have. You know, Heidegger thought that it was hypocritical for people who had been Nazis complain later that they had made a mistake. He thought that was hypocritical. He didn't want to be one of those people, as though somehow that was worse than not complaining. Not, you understand the problem? There's a real moral problem there. So, so that really disturbed him. But he was happy to read Being in Time with Me in 1960. He thought it was an important book that he wanted us to read together.
We've come full circle. Started off with you talking about reading Being in Time with Marcuse, and
Yeah.
we end the podcast about, you reading Being in Time with Marcuse. So thank you for being here, Professor Feenberg. It's been an absolute pleasure. Very grateful you've spent this much time, and I think listeners will get a lot of value from this. Those who are all the new people who are trying to get introduced to theory and philosophy and are stumbling on Marcuse and not knowing where to look no further than Andrew Feenberg's book. I think it's probably the best secondary resource on Marcuse that I've read ever, probably, honestly, and because there's not enough. So, yeah, thanks for being here. Hopefully, the listeners who enjoy this will give a 5-star rating. It really helps people discover the show and, get exposed to all these great intellectuals who I have the pleasure of having on my show. So, thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.